Hi, hello. This is Mackenzie Lockett, your instructor, and welcome virtually to Psychology 3400, Social Psychology. I'm really excited to be working with you guys this semester, even in these weird, unprecedented times. So, like I said, my name is Mackenzie Lockett. There's a picture I just took in my house earlier today. Um, I'm never very interested in learning about my instructors, but I thought you guys might be, especially considering this is all online. So I got my bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of Missouri in 2016. And then I came here to UCCS to start my PhD program in clinical psychology. So in 2019, I got my master's degree in clinical psychology. And then I actually took a year off and lived in the Netherlands where I did full-time research for a year. And now I am continuing my PhD and it's being granted by both UCCS and the Free University of Amsterdam. So that's kind of a fun fact about me. My research interests are in post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, but I'm also really interested in how PTSD affects our social and emotional processes. And so because of that, I do a lot of social psychology research to understand how trauma affects these different social psychological mechanisms that we study. So my office hours are 2 to 4 p.m. every Monday and 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. every Thursday, and also by appointment. I wanted to give you guys a lot of opportunities for FaceTime since we are doing this asynchronous. You can see the syllabus for the Zoom link to the office hours. Okay, so before we jump into the lecture, I just wanted to go over a brief class overview of what this class is going to be like for you guys. So we're going to have weekly lectures with corresponding chapter readings and quizzes. The weekly lectures will probably be around 2 hours long. I tend to talk fast, so I'm going to put them on the shorter side. Today's lecture is going to be also a bit short, but there are some videos that will make up for the time that you guys should definitely watch. Each week you will have a chapter of the textbook to read, and you will have a quiz that corresponds to that chapter of the textbook. So there is no quiz this week because I wanted you guys to get settled in, and I know some of you are still kind of struggling to track down the textbook. There's also no quiz the last week of lectures, and I really just did that because the quizzes make up 10% of your grade, and if I did that, each quiz would be worth 1% of your grade, and I liked how easy that was. The quizzes are all derived from the chapter reading, so you don't need to watch the lecture to be able to do the quizzes. Each week, the lecture will be posted by Thursday morning, and then the quiz is due the Sunday after that. That said, you can do the quizzes whenever you want. They're all posted on Canvas already, so once you have Launchpad, you should be able to take them. The remainder of your grade will be made up by 3 exams. Each exam is worth 30% of your grade. We also have an optional cumulative final exam that you can take that will replace your lowest exam score. So if you miss an exam, or if you did really poorly on one and you want to make up for it, you can take that final. I would suggest that everyone prepare like you're going to take the cumulative final until you know for sure what your grade's going to be. So just be keeping in mind that you might be taking that in December. The guidelines for if you need to miss a quiz or an exam are outlined in the syllabus, but basically you need to talk to me beforehand. I'm going to be a lot less lenient if you message me after the exam or the quiz. Because this class is asynchronous, there's not a specific exam time, so exams will be posted. I think in the syllabus I said that they'd be posted on Thursdays, and then you'll get through the weekend to complete them. And exams are open book because you guys are all at home, so it's open book. Finally, you'll be able to get extra credit through the SONA system, research participation, or through writing research reports. So for those of you not familiar with SONA, I'm pretty sure Laura Chandler, who is one of our administrative people in the department, I'm pretty sure she sent out an email about how to get acquainted with that. If you haven't gotten that, you can probably email her about it. So you will log on to SONA and choose research participation options through there. You can get up to 5 extra credit points of research participation, and every half hour of research participation is zero point 0.5 credits. Just know that when you take part of that research, you are often helping graduate students get their theses and their dissertations done, and so you are really doing a great service to the graduate students in the psychology department. If you don't want to do research participation, you can write research reports instead. This is again outlined in the syllabus, but basically you will find an article referenced in your textbook and do a write-up on it. But that needs to be approved by me first. So find the article you want, email me, and we'll talk about it. Okay, so I just wanted to cover the class text briefly. I've sent a couple announcements about it. So this is the required textbook for the class. Any format is fine. I don't care, whatever makes you happy. What is important is that Launchpad is required, so make sure whatever format you're getting does have a Launchpad access code. I think this is going to be really helpful for you guys as you go through this class in an online setting. And we'll be doing quizzes through Launchpad. And so because of that, Launchpad and Canvas need to be connected for grading purposes. If you don't know how to do this, you can email me, but I think it's pretty intuitive on Canvas. One other thing I wanted to note is that I think this textbook is really great, but some people complain that it's a little wordy or boring. And so I just want you to take the perspective that the authors are really big nerds who are really excited for you to learn about social psychology. So if you ever feel like it's going on and on, it's because they really want you to understand what's going on in this phenomenon that they talk about. So do what you need to take away the important information, and just know that it can be a bit lengthy at times. Okay, so we can go ahead and jump into our first lecture. And we'll start by asking, what is social psychology? And if we were in person, I would really want to hear your guys' opinion on it, because what I found is that people often assume social psychology is really just focused on the psychology of interpersonal relationships. But that's really not the case. Social psychology is a very broad field that ultimately asks, why do people behave the way they do? Social psychology is the scientific study of the causes and consequences of people's thoughts, feelings, and actions regarding both themselves and other people. So we call this broad area of psychological science social psychology because social psychology as a field really truly believes that people are highly influenced by their social world, and that our interpersonal relationships and the social groups we belong to influence so much of our internal experience. It influences so much of the way we feel, perceive, and interact with ourselves and other people. And so you can take a step back and think about your own development and how none of us would be who we are without the influence of our parents, our siblings, our friends, the expectations put forth by our social groups and our government. Almost everything we do is influenced by our social relationships in one way or another. And that will be a theme that we touch on a lot in this lecture and throughout this course. There are 4 core assumptions of social psychology that you should be very familiar with. Most of the ideas in social psychology build on these basic assumptions, and they're all very important. So we're going to spend at least one slide on each. So our first assumption that we'll talk about is this idea that behavior is a joint product of the person and the situation. So the great lesson of social psychology is that one's immediate environment can have a powerful effect on one's behavior. So it might be helpful to take a few minutes right now to stop and reflect on times when you've been in an environment that has really greatly affected the way you acted. It might be hard to come up with something because it's so natural and normal to us, but you can consider how when you go to a classroom, whenever the last time that was, you know to sit down, to be quiet as soon as the lecturer starts talking, to raise your hand to ask questions. So that in itself is this example of how the environment guides behavior. Nonetheless, dispositions or individual differences exist. And so what this means is that there are consistent preferences, ways of thinking, and behavioral tendencies that can affect how someone acts regardless of the environment they're in. You might be the type of person, or maybe you can think of a friend you have, who loves to talk, is kind of loud, maybe interrupts a lot, and maybe you've been in a situation where you're kind of in a quiet place and they're talking loudly as if nothing's a problem. And I can personally say I've been very embarrassed in those situations. And so that's a great example of how someone's individual difference, right, their tendency to be very talkative, persists regardless of the environment. So social psychology aims to understand how both environments and individual differences contribute to the behavior. This idea that one is more important than the other is really not something that social psychology is interested in testing. Rather, the field really wants to acknowledge the contribution of both and how they interact with one another. Our second assumption is that behavior depends on a socially constructed view of reality. What does this even mean? Is this a Matrix reference? I'm not sure because I haven't actually seen The Matrix. But what this means, that behavior depends on a socially constructed view of reality, is that many of the things that we believe to be true or right or consistent in our world are actually only that way because we as a group of people have decided so. So there are plenty of things that we take for granted in the United States that are actually quite different in other areas of the world. This can be somewhat mundane things, like how in the United Kingdom they drive on the left side of the road. But there's something about that that seems weird, right? You're like, this isn't okay that they're doing that. But really, it's fine. It's just how they have decided things should be. This can also extend to social mores and morals. So things that we believe to be polite or impolite or to be moral or immoral really depend on the culture and the social group that you're in. So this is related to the idea that our understanding of the world is socially constructed. Along those lines, even when we're alone, people often occupy our thoughts. We spend a lot of time thinking about other people and the time we're going to spend with them, their feelings for us. We want to make sure our friends like us and take care of them, and we want our professors and our bosses to be impressed with us. Really, this assumption is about how humans are inherently social animals who spend a lot of time thinking about their social group and being impacted by the different social rules that have been created. It's also important to note here social comparison theory, which basically states that people determine their own status or worth by comparing themselves to others. And so this also relates to the idea of a socially constructed view of reality, because there's no objective good or bad or right or wrong. It depends on the people around you. So you might determine that you are a good student by the grades that you're assigned by your professor, who's another person. Or you might decide that you are a good student because you think you get better grades than other people. And so most of our comparisons are based on how others are doing. Our third assumption is that behavior is strongly influenced by our social cognition. So what is social cognition? For anyone who's read the book yet, I thought their definition was a little vague. But first, I think that social cognition is a natural consequence of living in a social world. And really, what it refers to is how people process, store, and apply information about other people in social situations. So, this is best demonstrated by social cognitive theory, which is a theory that states that people learn how to behave in situations in part from observing others in that situation. A great example of this is if you've ever seen, a little kid who likes to dress like their older sibling or is maybe imitating their parents in the way they clean or watch TV. It's always really cute. And really, what they're doing is a perfect example of social cognitive theory. They are learning how to be a human by watching other humans. And so, this is one example of social cognition. They are seeing how to act and then they're storing it. And it's ultimately all of a social interaction. Another example of that is very salient to me is going to a coffee shop that you've never been to before. Remember coffee shops, guys? They were so nice. I miss them. Coffee shops, though, stress me out a little bit because really it can be quite different each time you go to a new coffee shop. Some coffee shops want you to sit down and they'll come take your order when you're ready. Other coffee shops want you to go to the cash register and buy your drink, but they might want you to stay at the counter and wait for your drink there, or they might want you to go sit down and they'll bring you your drink. And so in these situations, I find myself always looking to the people around me to see what I'm supposed to be doing. It's through seeing how other people are acting in that coffee shop that I get the sense of what I'm expected to do. So that's another example of how social cognition influences behavior. Not only, though, does our social cognition influence our behavior, but it influences how we judge others' behaviors. You might have grown up in a family where you were told that eating with your elbows on the table was very bad and so rude and so awful. And then imagine going to your friend's house and everyone's elbows are on the table. And you might then be likely to judge them as rude or bad because you were raised to assume that way. But sort of similar to what we were talking about on the past slide about the social construction of reality, it's not inherently bad or good, it's just what you've been taught in a social world. Okay, so our fourth assumption of social psychology is that the best way to understand social behavior is to use the scientific method. We're going to spend several slides talking about how people try to understand social behavior and why the scientific method is the best. So first we're going to discuss some of the other ways that people try to understand human behavior. The first is through introspection, so asking people to explain why they behave the way they do. Um, this can be effective, but one issue is that people often don't understand why they do things. So there were a series of studies done in the 70s and 80s by Nisbet and Wilson. What a terrible name, Nisbet. Ugh. And in this one particular study, they brought in some women, a sample of women, and they showed them a table that had 4 sets of stockings on it. And they asked them to choose their favorite pair of stockings and to explain why they chose it over the other ones. And each woman came up with, a great description of why the stockings they chose were clearly the superior ones. But what these women didn't know was that each pair of stockings was actually identical to one another. Um, and that women just tended to choose the stockings that were at the end of the table because it was probably the pair that they saw last. And so this shows us that we often have these preferences or we make these choices and they might be random or we might not know why we have our preferences. That said, introspection might be more helpful for other types of things, like asking someone why they chose psychology as a major. They probably didn't choose that as randomly as they would choose a pair of stockings from a table. Nonetheless, introspection can be limited and it shouldn't be relied on as a way of really understanding human behavior on a scientific level. We often use intuition as well to understand someone's behavior. And so we do this by making inferences um, about why people do what they do. The issue here is that each person has a limited and unique perspective that's been influenced by their own life experiences. So I was just talking about social cognition and how this influences how we judge behavior. That's relevant here. So you may think that you're making objective inferences about someone's behavior, but really you're influenced by all the things that you've learned as a human growing up in your life. And so because of this, it's important to note here that people tend to have a confirmation bias. So this refers to the tendency to view events and people in the world in a way that fits our desires and expectations. For example, if I really strongly believe that bad things happen to people because they deserve it, then when someone has their car totaled because another person ran into them, I'm going to be more likely to infer that that person is a bad person who deserved it. That's kind of an extreme example, but that's one way that this can play out, and clearly that would be problematic. Confirmation bias also comes up when it comes to analyzing science. And I think that's a very important thing, especially right now when it comes to the pandemic. Um, so, right now, there is a lot of research and a lot of opinions coming out on whether people should be wearing masks. And some people think that masks are key to stopping the spread of the virus. And others feel like masks aren't very helpful at all and that they're just kind of serving to keep people to feel safe when they're not actually helping. Regardless of how you feel, you are probably more likely to judge research supporting your belief on masks as better research, right? Maybe you're sharing on Facebook studies about how masks are helpful and aren't helpful, but you're probably not sharing research about whatever the opposite of your opinion is. So that's a very on point, relevant example of confirmation bias. But confirmation bias has been a thing for a while. So these researchers in the 1970s found that when people were presented with evidence for or against capital punishment, people were more convinced by evidence that supported their initial view. So it's not only that we seek out information that confirms our view, but we are more likely to judge that information as more convincing or better quality. This also has implications for anxiety. So people with social anxiety demonstrated cognitive biases towards anxiety-related logical syllogisms. And so what this means is that they were more likely to rate anxiety-related logical syllogisms as correct, even when they weren't correct, as a way of confirming these fears that they have around social situations. So this brings us to the scientific method. The scientific method helps us reduce our biases and move beyond our unique yet limited views of the world. It's a process for developing, testing, and refining ideas about our understanding of others and the world around us. So the scientific method is very systematic in how it works, and that you first form a hypothesis, so some kind of research question, and then you collect data and you analyze that data, and then you form your conclusions. And so what's important to note here is that every conclusion is limited. No scientific finding is perfect or the end all be all. So anytime you see a news heading that tells you some new amazing scientific study, it's important to realize that those are going to be limited in some way. And we're going to talk a lot about limitations as this lecture continues. So finally, because our conclusions are often limited, they drive future research and contribute to the development of theories. So we're going to talk a lot more about this as we continue. Here is another more in-depth infographic of the scientific method. And I have an example for you guys. So um, let's say I'm interested in differences between siblings. And specifically, I want to test if older siblings versus younger siblings are more financially responsible. And so I look into the existing research, and maybe I find some research suggesting that older siblings tend to be more pragmatic or responsible overall. So then I create this hypothesis that older siblings will be more financially responsible with their money than younger siblings will be. Then I have an experiment where I test this, and my analysis confirms that I'm right because I'm amazing. It's perfect. Then this comes to my conclusion that yes, older siblings are more financially responsible than younger siblings. But really, what this conclusion leaves me with are so many questions. Why? Is it because they are more pragmatic, or is it some other reason? It also leads me to wonder, is this always the case? Is it only the case when there are two siblings? Is it the case when there are four or six siblings? What if there are only half siblings or a parent got remarried at some point? What if my sample really just existed of a bunch of people from Colorado? Do people in Wyoming show the same effects? These are all possible limitations and questions that we have for future research that we're going to discuss more as this lecture continues. Okay, that was a lot. So if you are someone who needs to take a break, go ahead and take a break now. This is a good stopping point before we move on into the next section of this lecture. But of course, anyone else can just continue going, do whatever you want, follow your heart. So now we're going to talk about how the scientific method translates into knowledge. So our scientific method helps us collect information, but then we need to organize and really understand what that information means. So data are pieces of information you collect in some way, and the associations among the pieces of information you collect. So pieces of information can refer to blood samples, heart rates, responses to a self-report questionnaire, demographic information like age and gender. All of these are pieces of information, and some of them might be associated, such as self-reported optimism being associated with age. However, your data needs to be explained, and theory is what is an explanation of your data. So theories are confirmed or modified through the confirmation of hypotheses. So when we use the scientific method, we develop a hypothesis, we test it through data collection, and then the conclusions help us form or clarify the theory that we have. Data are consistent or inconsistent with existing theories, and if they're inconsistent, more data is collected to understand inconsistencies and potentially modify theories. Okay, so I have an example for you guys that I'm going to use to help demonstrate how data and theory inform one another. So your book talks about this using stereotype threat as their example theory. Stereotype threat is really interesting, very cool, but I didn't want to use the same example because I thought that would be boring. So make sure you read your chapter and you know what stereotype threat is about because you'll be asked about it on the exam. But today we're going to talk about self-verification theory. So according to self-verification theory, people seek out and like information more when it's consistent with their self-view. And this is theoretically true even for negative information. According to self-verification theory, people will prefer negative information that is consistent with themselves more than positive information that is inconsistent with their self-view. And Self-verification theory basically states that people want to be known and understood by others. And so because of that, they will prefer information that confirms their own views. That makes them feel known and understood. This is actually a bit of a controversial theory because a lot of social psychologists feel that there is always a motivation to feel good about yourself. And so hearing something negative, even if it's consistent with how you see yourself, should be harmful because you're hearing that you're not amazing and perfect. And so it would be great to get your guys' opinions on this if we were all together as to whether or not you feel that self-verification theory is really a thing. Because what I've found is that it really resonates with some people and it doesn't resonate at all with others. So let's go ahead and apply the scientific method to self-verification theory. And so let's say I'm interested in whether students who feel bad about their ability to work with others will respond to hearing that. So we sample students who indicated on a screening that they believe that they're bad at working with others. That means they would have answered questions like, I don't work well with others, I'm bad at sharing responsibility, I'm a bad team player, etc. So these are the people that we sample, and our hypothesis, building from self-verification theory, is that students who believe they are bad at teamwork will respond more positively to a comment that they are bad at teamwork versus a comment that they're good at teamwork. And so then we run the study and we collect our data. So in this study, we have participants come into the laboratory and they do a team exercise with a confederate. Confederates are described in your chapter, but a confederate is typically a researcher who is pretending to be a participant. So that way the actual participant isn't aware of what's being measured. So here, if a researcher, right, like if a researcher told the participant that they were bad at teamwork, the participant might brush them off. They might be like, well, this researcher is just trying to rile me up. But if they think it's coming from another person that they're working with who's there participating in the study, it's more likely to be effective. So here in the study, we're using a confederate. And in the study, the participant does a team exercise with the confederate, and then the confederate tells the participant that they're bad or good at working with others. So here we're using random assignment where we've randomly decided which participants are being told that they're good and which participants are being told that they're bad. It doesn't really matter what their performance was on the team exercise. Participants then indicate how much they liked the confederate on a self-report questionnaire. Our data analysis shows that participants reported liking the Confederate more when the Confederate commented that they were bad at working with others versus when the Confederate complimented them on their ability to work with others. So our conclusion then here is that the data is consistent with the theory. Self-verification theory states that people prefer consistent negative information compared to inconsistent positive information, and our data confirms this. Very exciting. But why? Like we already talked about, self-verification theory is pretty controversial. And doesn't it seem odd that you would respond positively to someone saying that you're bad at the task you just did, even if it's consistent with your self-views? So this shows us how our data can help confirm a theory, but also how it brings up further questions to be asked, further implications for the theory. So we confirmed our theory with our data, but we don't know why people who believe they're bad at working with others prefer hearing this compared to hearing something positive. From what we know about self-verification theory, it could be that hearing that negative feedback makes them feel understood, and that's why they liked the Confederate more. Excuse me. What are some other possible reasons why? And how can these ideas be tested? Now would be a good time, if you wanted to pause and kind of think through it, just to get your science muscles um, working and for me to stop talking so much. One way our main idea could be tested is by just simply doing the study again and then measuring how much our participant feels understood by the Confederate and see if that explains why they like them so much. But anyways, this really just acts as an example for the scientific process and how we collect data, think about our theories, collect more data, and so on. So it's a cyclical process that's always building on itself. Okay, so we have discussed how data and theory inform one another with using the scientific method. So now we're going to discuss in depth for a few minutes what makes a good theory. This is a really important part of this class. Our theories are very important explanations of human behavior that drive research. And so it's really important that our theories are good ones that can help direct future research endeavors. So first, a good theory organizes and explains observations. There is a chaotic and overwhelming amount of information out in the world. As we've already touched on in this lecture, it's not difficult to find research findings that contradict one another. A good theory organizes this chaotic information into something that is clearly organized and makes sense. It also builds on these organized observations to explain why we see what we see. So here we'll continue using self-verification as an example. So prior to self-verification theory, the general idea in social psychology was that people prefer hearing positive information about themselves because it feels good. This is generally referred to as self-enhancement. However, the creator of self-verification theory, William Swan, was working at a children's camp. And there was a child there that had some behavioral problems. He often acted out. He could be angry and rude. And what Swan and the people he worked with found was that this child seemed to respond negatively when they tried to be nice to him. This child had a really negative self-view of himself, and he wanted others to see himself that way too. And so the creator of self-verification theory, Swan, organized these observations into self-verification theory. He noticed that sometimes people prefer positive feedback and sometimes people prefer negative feedback. And he explained these observations by suggesting that we prefer things that are consistent with our self-view, and that we prefer things that are consistent with our self-view because they make us feel understood. Self-verification theory is pretty parsimonious. It easily describes a wide range of behavior, just simply based on the idea that people like things that are consistent with their self-view. A good theory provides directions for future research, and self-verification does this by having such a central proponent that is very simple. Self-verification theory can be tested easily and in a number of domains, making it, in another way, a good theory for social psychology. Along these lines, a good theory also generates new questions. So, even though self-verification theory explains behavior, basically as seeking things that are consistent with one's self-view, it also brings up new questions as to why. One, why do we need to feel understood? Do we always prefer consistency, or do we sometimes want to hear positive things even when we do feel negatively about ourselves? Self-verification theory also has implications for fields across several domains. So, in its, original conceptualization, it was clearly very relevant to how children with behavioral problems act and reinforce their own behavior. It has implications for performance in general, also for how people function in their lives, and it could have implications for therapy. So along those lines, a good theory has practical value, and something like self-verification theory does, because it's important to us to understand why people seek out information the way they do and how they're maintaining negative versus positive self-concepts. So then how do we make a good theory? We know what makes up a good theory. We know that a theory should be interesting, should generate new questions, should have practical value, but ultimately a theory needs to be supported by the research findings that it inspires. And there are several things to consider when it comes to that. So for the next section, we are going to talk about data, methodology, and statistical analysis, and important things that you should be considering as you move forward in this class and in your progression in any other psychology courses you might take. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about here is data, which, as I mentioned earlier, refers to just pieces of information that you collect in your research study. When developing your own research study or reading someone else's research, it's really important to closely look at the type of data they're collecting. When a research study, for example, says that it is measuring intelligence, what it is actually measuring is something that is an operationalization of intelligence. Intelligence is just a concept, and we actually measure it in a lot of different ways. And so the operational definition refers to a specific, concrete method of measuring or manipulating a conceptual variable. When it comes to intelligence, something like performance on an IQ test, ACT or SAT scores, and high school GPA all reflect operationalizations of the concept of intelligence. When you're looking at a research study, you want to see how they're operationalizing their variables of interest and try to understand to what extent those operationalizations show construct validity. So construct validity refers to the degree to which a measure assesses what it intends to assess. So for each of these measures of intelligence that we have here on the right, hopefully you can see my arrow, we want to think about how much validity they have as a construct. How much do they really reflect intelligence? So when it comes to performance on an IQ test, that's a pretty good measure of intelligence, but really intelligence is a pretty wide range of traits and behaviors. So performance on an IQ test might not reflect creative intelligence, for example. When we look at something like ACT and SAT scores, as well as high school GPA, those happened when people were in high school. So if you're working with people who are in their 30s or 40s, you have to wonder, how valid are those as measures of intelligence? One other way that we look at construct validity is by seeing how much different measures of the same construct relate to one another. So if we want to understand the construct validity of performance on an IQ test as a measure of intelligence, we would want to see how much it relates to ACT/SAT scores and high school GPA and any other relevant measures of intelligence. When a given measure highly relates to other measures of the same concept, it is implied to have high construct validity. On the other hand, if we found out that high school GPA didn't correlate very highly with performance on an IQ test and standardized scores, we would then conclude that high school GPA doesn't have good construct validity for intelligence. Another thing to keep in mind when looking at research is whether or not there are any confounds in the data. And so confound is a variable other than the conceptual variable intended to be manipulated or tested that may be responsible for the effect on the dependent variable. So, for example, let's say you wanted to look at how physical activity levels relate to weight loss or weight gain. So you would measure the extent to which someone is active on a daily or weekly basis and then look at how much they weigh. A possible confound there would be age. So as people get older, especially as they get elderly, they tend to be less physically active. Also, as people get older, they tend to gain weight, in part because they're not physically active, but also because metabolism slows. So age would be a confounding factor there. Next, we're going to talk a bit about methodology. The methods in a research project really just refer to how studies are designed and how the scientific data is measured. Your methods are incredibly important because they are really most closely related to the conclusions you can take away from your study. And that'll become clear as we go through these next couple slides. So first we're going to talk about research study designs. There are a couple different ones that are very important. The first one is correlational research studies. So a correlational study involves two or more pre-existing variables that are measured and analyzed to determine to what extent they're associated. So in the last slide, we just talked about physical activity level and weight. So when I referenced that, I was really referencing a correlational approach to it. We would be looking at physical activity as it's already been happening for participants and measure their existing weight gain. Nothing would be manipulated or randomly assigned. Because of that, correlation does not imply causation. I'm sure you guys have heard that a ton. You see news headlines that say something like drinking coffee is associated with cancer. And the implication is that drinking coffee causes cancer, when in fact the study didn't test that at all. It just found that for whatever reason, coffee consumption is associated with cancer. In reality, when you have a correlational study, it's just as likely that one of the variables causes the other one. So it doesn't seem very feasible that having cancer would cause you to drink more coffee, but maybe you get cancer and you get really stressed out, so you drink more coffee. Or instead of physical activity changing your weight, changes in weight might cause you to be more or less active. So correlational studies can be very helpful, especially when you are first building a theory. Just knowing that there's an association among constructs you're interested in is very important and very interesting. But that said, not knowing causality can really limit your understanding of the research and its implications. Another issue that comes up in correlational research designs is the third variable problem. So two variables may be correlated, but a third variable may be responsible for their association. So cities with more churches have a higher crime rate. When you think about it, there's really no reason that these two things should be associated. But one reason why they might be is because of population. So as population increases, so do the number of churches that are in a given area, and so does the crime rate. The next kind of study design you really need to know about are experimental study designs. So in an experimental research project, an independent variable is manipulated or randomly assigned to participants to test whether it has a causal effect. The thing about these studies is that because people are randomly assigned to one of two or more conditions, they should be the same on everything else except for that independent variable that you're manipulating. If they're the same on everything else, then that means you can conclude that the independent variable you're manipulating has a causal effect. So if we sampled students and randomly assigned them to receive a compliment or to receive nothing at all, and then measured how happy they felt afterwards, we would know that things like age, gender, race, personality factors such as optimism wouldn't matter because theoretically either group that they're in should have the same level of those characteristics. The only thing that's different between the two groups is your experimental manipulation. Because of this, our experimental studies also don't need to worry about third variable problems because again, whatever that third variable might be would be constant across the groups. And so if the independent variable that's being manipulated has a causal effect over and beyond what the two groups are consisting of, then you can conclude that it's a causal effect. Correlational and experimental study designs can and should be combined when studying how individual differences combine with experimental effects. Research increasingly combines these two things. So it's definitely possible to just do an experimental design and absolutely possible to just do a correlational design. But when you combine both of them, you get a lot of really important information. The correlational aspect tells you about people with pre-existing variables. You can't randomly assign someone to have a certain personality characteristic. You can't randomly assign someone to be of a certain gender or race. You can't randomly assign someone to have experienced stressful childhood experiences. So when we want to understand how people of a certain gender or a certain background respond to a manipulated variable, we use these designs that combine correlation and experimental techniques. Other study designs you need to know about are longitudinal studies. So in a longitudinal study, two or more variables are measured at multiple points in time. This often allows us to understand causality as well because we can see, one, how things change over time, and two, if things at an earlier time point predict things at a later time point. So this study found that violent television watching in childhood predicts adult aggressive behavior, but aggressiveness in childhood did not predict violent television watching in adulthood. So that finding right there takes care of the reverse causality problem, right? This concern that the association between two variables could have a causality in either direction. So we can see here that there's really only a relationship in one direction. The violent television watching in childhood predicts adult aggressive behavior. That then suggests that watching television that's violent in childhood causes adult aggressive behavior, although I do acknowledge that that is a bit of a controversial statement. On the flip side of a longitudinal study is a cross-sectional study. So when a study is cross-sectional, two or more variables are measured at a specific point in time. So what you'll find is that studies are often described as experimental or correlational or both, and then longitudinal or cross-sectional. So you might be reading a paper that describes something as a cross-sectional experimental study. And so you can know immediately that that means that they collected data at one point in time and that something was manipulated or randomly assigned. It's also important to note here that cross-sectional, cross-sectional studies might not imply causality unless it's an experimental cross-sectional study. So something that's cross-sectional and correlational, you really have no way of knowing how the variables influence one another in a time-based way. You just know at that point in time, these things are associated. Okay, so another important aspect of methodology that you should be familiar with is external validity. So the extent to which a research finding can be generalized to other people, other places, other times. One important question to ask here is, what are the sample characteristics? The characteristics of the sample that you collected for your research study tend to be very important for understanding the extent that the study's findings can be externalized to society at large. So for example, would a study sampling elderly white men have the same findings as a study sampling middle-aged Hispanic women? This is especially important when you consider the assumptions of social psychology, particularly the ones about social cognition. So as we talked about earlier in this lecture, social cognition refers to the information that we process and hold about the social world. And we process this information through seeing how others act in the world. So in that sense, our social group is very important, and the type of social groups that you belong to will inform your social cognition, which will then inform how you react in situations and how you react to others' behaviors in situations. So because of this, when it comes to social psychology, it's very important to understand whether or not the sample is diverse and representative. If it's not, then there are some limitations to the extent that the study is generalizable, which doesn't mean it's a bad study, it's just another limitation to understand. This often comes up because a lot of social psychology studies are done on college students. College students themselves can be pretty diverse, but there is a shared level of socioeconomic status, of academic interest and intelligence, and the fact that college students tend to be young. Because of all of this, it's hard to know if results found in a sample of college students will look the same as a sample of 45-year-olds or a sample of people who didn't finish high school. This is a major issue in the field that's being talked about a lot, and so when it comes to looking at the research in your book and in papers you might read, you want to keep this in mind. Another aspect of the external validity to consider is, to what extent do your study's manipulations really imply something about a larger phenomenon? So let's revisit self-verification theory. Self-verification theory says that people prefer feedback that is consistent with their self-view, even if it's negative, and that they will prefer negative, consistent feedback compared to positive, inconsistent feedback. We technically proved this, right, in our hypothetical research study where we found that people preferred negative, consistent feedback compared to positive, inconsistent feedback. That said, we don't really know whether or not self-verification will hold up in other situations other than the one that we studied. So we studied people who felt that they were bad at working in teams, responding to a Confederate's feedback about them. Would self-verification theory still hold up if the negative characteristic wasn't important to the participant? Maybe someone wouldn't care if they got inconsistent feedback if it was about something that doesn't matter very much to them. Similarly, would self-verification theory hold up if it was a close friend versus a random Confederate giving them the negative feedback? So these issues in external validity, you can see, likely feed into the research process, especially this last question. That's a great one, and that's a new study. You could do another self-verification study manipulating who's giving the feedback and see if that changes how people respond to it. Okay, so we have talked about data and methods so far, and now we're going to talk about another important piece of understanding research, which are just some statistical terms to be familiar with. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but it's important that you be aware of these things. So the first thing to know is that the majority of psychological research is built off of null hypothesis significance testing. So this is a specific method of statistical inference where a hypothesis is tested against a hypothesis of no effect or no relationship. So our null hypothesis is that there's no association, no effect, no relationship. And our alternative hypothesis is that there is some kind of relationship or an effect. The goal is to reject the null hypothesis. And so most of the stats you're going to see in psychology research are focused on this idea of rejecting the null hypothesis. When it comes to our self-verification theory example, our null hypothesis would be that there would be no effect of the type of feedback given on liking for the Confederate. And our alternative hypothesis would be that there would be an effect of the type of feedback given on liking the Confederate, and specifically negative feedback would lead to more liking for the Confederate. So within the statistical framework, you reject the null hypothesis by reaching a certain statistical significance level in your analyses. So statistical significance refers to the probability of the analysis rejecting the null hypothesis, given that the null hypothesis is true. I see that I say null hypotheses is true there. I apologize for my typo. So typically in our research, we use p-values to denote a significance level, and it tends to be p less than 0.05. Here I have a video that I want you guys to watch. I'm not going to open it up during the recording, but you can stop the recording and go watch it. It's less than 10 minutes. And it also explains the p-value in a similar way that I did, but I think it does it more in depth and certainly better than I can do it. The next statistical term you need to know about is an effect size. So an effect size simply gives you the strength of a given association. One common effect size is the correlation coefficient. Your book talks about this. The correlation coefficient typically denotes the strength of an association as well as its direction. So a positive association means that as one level of one variable increases, so does the level of the other variable. So as hungriness increases, so does anger, i.e. hangriness. A negative association means that as the level of one variable increases, the level of the other variable decreases. So as hungriness increases, happiness decreases. Effect sizes are very important because it tells you the magnitude of whatever result you're observing is. So if something has a small effect size, it might not have that much practical value for the real world. Whereas if it has a large effect size, then it's certainly very relevant. So finding out, for example, that coffee drinking is associated with cancer risk sounds scary, but if you find that the effect size is actually quite small, then you might not care that much about it. I know I certainly don't. So here it's important to compare to a p-value. So whereas a p-value simply tells you the likelihood that you would see a given result if the null hypothesis was true, an effect size explains the strength of the result. So you really need both of these when you are deeply analyzing a research project. When it comes to the findings that are talked about in your book, it's often just talking about things that are statistically significant and not necessarily about the given effect. You'll be able to tell if it's talking about the effect because it'll often talk about, the strength of the effect or the effect size or the amount of variance accounted for. All of those things refer to an effect size. Typically, though, when your book is talking about a research study that found something, what they're simply saying is that the null hypothesis was rejected because the p-value was small. Okay, I'm going through these slides very quickly, but now is another really good break time for you guys. We are done talking about data and methods, and we're going to swing into a different section of chapter 1 for the remaining part of the lecture. Okay. So for the next portion of the lecture, we'll be discussing limitations of science and what this means for understanding social psychology. So one of the first limitations is that humans cannot possibly know every aspect of reality. So something that we are very deeply aware of now is that humans are limited in the things that they can personally experience. So we are now aware that animals like dogs and bats have this capacity to hear that humans can't. And of course, we've developed the technology to be able to observe these things, even if we can't personally experience them. But this leads us to acknowledge that there may be aspects of reality that we are completely unaware of and therefore cannot study or understand. Some people in this class may be very interested in neuroscience, and you can think about how much information has changed about neuroscience and our understanding of how the brain is related to behavior in just the last 100 years. And that, our forefathers of psychology had no understanding of what neuroscience can tell us about psychology now. And so this is another example of how we don't know what we don't know, and at some point we might stumble upon it, and it could change our understanding of the science as a whole. Another limitation of science is that although the scientific method is objective, humans are not. So scientific questions and scientific analysis is really influenced by a range of biases, values, and preferences. Again, we have hit upon the concept of social cognition a lot in this lecture and how this influences the way that people behave and the way it influences their judgments of others' behaviors. This is true for scientists as well. Every scientist comes from a personal and cultural background that might influence the way they ask scientific questions and the way they think the scientific questions should be measured and tested. So, as I mentioned, my PhD is in clinical psychology, and I study post-traumatic stress disorder. But I also do a lot of research in social psychology. And I have found that clinical psychology professors that I work with react to trauma research much more differently than social psychology professors I work with. The clinical psychologists I work with don't think very much about the impact of asking about trauma. They don't see very much of an issue about asking participants what traumas they've been exposed to, what symptoms they have associated with their traumas, etc. What I've noticed is social psychologists that I work with who don't really have clinical training or a lot of knowledge of the clinical fields are very uncomfortable about the impact about asking about trauma. And so they feel very hesitant to ask about trauma and want to think of ways of measuring and studying trauma in a way that doesn't directly ask participants. And so you can see here how psychologists in two different fields might approach a similar question differently based on their backgrounds. So there was a really cool study that happened a few years ago where several research teams were given the same data set and asked to investigate a simple research question. That is, are soccer referees more likely to give red cards to dark skin tone players than light skin tone players? This is a very simple question, but what emerged was that each team used different statistics and came up with different conclusions. There was a range of effect sizes reported, and not every team came up with findings that were statistically significant. So the reason why this was is that even though they were given a pretty simple question, the data set itself included variables that may or may not be relevant to this question. So, for example, there was a variable about the extent to which a given referee typically gives out red cards. And there's a variable about the proportion of dark skin tone players to light skin players. So here, different researchers might see these things as more or less relevant to their research question and analyze the study accordingly and subsequently end at different results. This is a really important and interesting study because it shows how much that small decision-making processes in a research project can lead to wildly different conclusions. When I talk about this, what I'm referring to is researcher degrees of freedom. So when researcher degrees of freedom come into play, what that is basically referring to is the decisions that are made during the research process that can greatly influence the outcomes, even though the researchers might not be aware of it. This can happen in the data analysis stage, but it can also happen in the development of a study or while a study is being run. So one thing you can think about is that when it comes to eventually potentially doing your own research, is that especially if you're building off of an existing theory, you might not have results that come out the same. And one of the reasons why is could be because of these researcher degrees of freedom that often come into play. So I would really recommend everyone actually go and read this write-up because it's really fantastic and a lot of fun. You're not going to be tested on anything beyond this slide, but it would probably be good for you. Our next limitation of science to discuss is a little dark, but it's important. So not only are humans not objective, but scientists, who are in fact humans, are motivated by other things besides scientific values. Careers, financial well-being, and egos are all on the line when someone is doing scientific research. When you look at your professors, you know they're there because they care about science and they care about society and they want to benefit it. But they also want to be successful and they also want to make money and they also want to be the best at what they do. And so all of these things are related to what kind of science they do. So in 2011, there was Diederik Stapel, who was a Dutch professor who was suspended after he was found to be fabricating and manipulating data for his research publications. Since then, 58 of his publications have been retracted, and he stated that he couldn't withstand the pressure to publish and to be successful, and that's why he did it. This excuse isn't a justification. What he did was unethical and horrible. But what it suggests is that scientists are motivated to succeed, and that might impact the ways they do science. I don't think many scientists are actually fabricating and manipulating data. I started college shortly after this occurred, and I remember talking to my psychology professors at the time, and there was just so much shock and horror about what Diederik Stapel did. But the motivation to be successful might drive people to study some ideas over other ideas. So there are certain, research hypotheses that might seem risky, right? That might seem not like a good idea to study because if they don't work out, then you've wasted time and it basically has no benefit to your career. And so you can think about that as well, that perhaps some of the limitations to science are because Scientists are motivated by their own personal feelings, and that can drive them to do certain kinds of science over other kinds of science. It also might lead them to fabricate and manipulate data, but hopefully that's not happening too much. Okay, so now we're going to talk a bit about the evaluation of research. This is really a summary of so many of the things we've talked about today. I'm really hoping you leave this lecture, which has really not been that long, but feels like it's been 8 years for me, taking away this information and being able to apply it critically to the things you read in your textbook, and just in general, and things that you encounter in the world. So when it comes to evaluating research, first you want to understand the theory. What does the theory really say? How does it organize and explain data? Speaking of data, how is the data collected and quantified? How is each variable operationalized? What's the construct validity of the variables? Are there any confounds or possible third variables not addressed in the study? Along those lines, what is the study design? What does the study design imply? What doesn't it imply? So here's where you really want to be thinking about causality. Is there an experimental aspect to the study? Is any part of it longitudinal? Is it a correlational cross-sectional study? And even then, what can you take away from it? How generalizable is the study? What's that study sample? What was really studied in this research project that can imply something more generally about the world? Then you want to think about the statistical analyses. So depending on where you are in, your degree progression, you might not know very much about stats, and that's okay. But at some point, you'll want to think, what do the statistics imply about the findings? If the finding is statistically significant, what's the effect size? And so what's fun is that if you read any papers that were published before like 2010, you're probably not going to see any effect sizes, because for a long time, people only cared about statistical significance, and the relevance of effect sizes only became popular in recent years. So really here is like a cheat sheet for you for how to think about research going forward. I really encourage you to do this because I think it'll make your experience in this class, and just as a person who's studying psychology, more meaningful. And if you're looking to potentially go to grad school or to do research in a lab, using this as a cheat sheet will be very helpful for you when you're trying to impress important people that you need to impress. So next we're going to discuss ethical considerations in research. So the value of a research project has to be balanced with the potential harm it might bring to its participants. You've maybe heard of the Tuskegee syphilis study, a clinical study conducted by the US government to investigate the effects of untreated syphilis. This happened in the 1930s. Participants in the study were low-income African American men. They were told that they would be receiving free health care for their participation in a 6-month-long study. But what happened is the study went on for decades, and all during that time, these participants were not informed that they had syphilis, and they were not treated for syphilis, despite the fact that at a certain point in the study, it was common to treat syphilis with penicillin. Overall, participants in the study were misinformed about the aims of the project, the compensation they'd be receiving, and the pertinent health information collected in the study. The researchers at the time likely justified it as they wanted to understand the long-term effects of syphilis, which is an important thing to know. At that time, syphilis was a really serious condition that they didn't know a ton about. Al Capone had it. Fun fact. Nonetheless, modern ethics would suggest that knowing the long-term effects of syphilis is really not as important as the disruption of the rights of the participants. So, as psychology has progressed as a science, there has been an evolving understanding of what ethical research participation is. And the current perspective is that research cannot induce long-lasting or severe harm in its participants. Studies that induce temporary discomfort or stress are gray areas that are often up for debate. Researchers are constantly weighing the benefits and the risks to their projects and their participants, and often enacting as many safeguards as possible to minimize risks. So, as I mentioned, I do a lot of trauma research, and asking about trauma can sometimes be distressing. For most people, it's not, but some people do get upset with it. And so, what we often do is tell people before they start the study that they're going to be asked difficult questions, and at the end of the survey, give them resources for local and national mental health support lines. So, with this, we might be inducing temporary discomfort or stress, but we're also giving them an informed consent, which we'll talk a little bit more here on the next page. And we're also giving them resources to manage that stress. It is our responsibility as researchers to make sure that our participants are leaving their research participation just as well or even better than when they started. We have several ethical safeguards that exist to regulate research and maintain safe practices for research participants in psychology. So first there is the APA Code of Ethics. So this is from the American Psychological Association. You can look this up on the internet if you want to. It's not that fun, but it's very informative. This code of ethics is also maintained by ethical review boards. So these tend to be institutional organizations that review and approve research protocols. So there's no research happening on the UCCS campus that hasn't been approved by an ethical review board. Typically, when you submit your research to be published in a journal, you have to state that it was approved by an ethical review board and sometimes even give identifying information on your protocol so that way they can double check and make sure your research was done ethically. These ethical review boards pour over every detail of the study to make sure that participants are being respected and kept safe in their participation. Studies typically require informed consent, so I mentioned this on the last slide. Participants must be informed of the basic procedures that they will be subjected to and their participation. So this typically means telling them a little bit about the aims of the study and anything negative that they might be subjected to. So in my trauma research, we often tell people in the informed consent that they will be asked some distressing questions about their life experiences. Informed consents often clearly tell participants that they can stop their participation at any time. So an important part of ethical research practice is that participants never feel pressured to participate. They should always have the right to leave at any moment. And that's an important part of the consent process. Occasionally, studies won't completely tell participants about the aims of the study. In these studies, they rely on deception. So that is not telling participants the aims of the study or lying about the aims of the study to test hypotheses that could not be tested if the participant was aware of what was going on. So anytime something is potentially being manipulated in a study, participants aren't told about it. Because if they were told that something was being manipulated, they would get self-conscious and potentially not act naturally. So for example, in our self-verification theory example, we wouldn't tell participants that they were going to randomly be assigned negative or positive feedback. That would ruin the whole point of the survey. Similarly, we would deceive them about using a Confederate. So they wouldn't realize it was a researcher giving them the negative feedback, because again, if we told them that a researcher was giving them negative feedback, it might not affect them like it would if they thought it was some peer that they had just met. And so deception is ethically allowed when it is pertinent to the aims of the survey, or the study, excuse me, and when it doesn't seem to cause too much harm. So the deception in the Tuskegee syphilis study is not allowed, no matter what. Like, that was way too much harm and too much damage that couldn't be repaired, and that does not justify the deception. briefly lying to people about whether or not the person they're working with is a researcher or a student is much more acceptable deception. Finally, these studies often have debriefings. So debriefings tend to happen after the study has finished, and it's where participants are informed in greater detail about the aims of the study, particularly if deception was involved. So if we were really doing the self-verification study, it's during the debriefing we would tell that participant that actually the person they were working with was a Confederate, and that person was randomly assigned to give them feedback on their teamwork, and that feedback actually had nothing to do with how they worked on the team project. These debriefings are all in line with making sure that our participants feel agentic in their experience and research. Debriefings also are a time for researchers to get feedback on the study. Occasionally, participants start to have their own ideas or hypotheses about a research project. This is called demand characteristics. So demand characteristics can be problematic to research projects because people will consciously or unconsciously change their responses to the study because of demand characteristics. So if you go into a study thinking that you know what it's about, it might impact your natural reactions to the study. And so it's important for researchers to know that, because that means that you didn't have the same reaction to the study like people who weren't thinking about the study did. Demand characteristics are also talked about in your book. So if you have more questions on that, you can refer to it there or ask me follow-up questions at office hours. So here we have a video on some general ethical considerations for psychological research and 5 unethical experiments in early psychology. This guy's name is Hank Green. I really like him a lot. I think he's very engaging. And so he covers some of the basic principles in the APA Code of Ethics, and then discusses how they're related to 5 unethical experiments in early psychology. Again, I'm not going to play it here on the screen for you, but you should go and spend the 10 or so minutes watching it and taking notes on it. Okay, and we are at the end. So this lecture was a bit short. It'll probably be longer in the future, but I feel like I've really covered a lot of methods for you guys, so you probably don't need any more. A reminder, there is no quiz this week. So just watch the lecture, read the book when you get it, and then be prepared to take your first quiz by September 6th. So you can take that quiz whenever you want, just make sure to take it by then. The next class is the fundamentals of social behavior. So like I said, we covered a lot of sort of basic science and psychology stuff today that is slightly informed by social psychology. But nonetheless hasn't been very much about social psychology. So after today, we'll be getting a lot more into the fundamentals of social psychology and more specific social psychology concepts. So hopefully it'll get a bit more exciting from here. Although, like I said, I'm hoping you take a lot from this lecture away and apply it in the future. One other thing about the quiz is that Launchpad needs to be integrated with Canvas for your quiz grades to show up in the grade book. So once you get Launchpad, make sure that you are integrating it with Canvas. If you are having troubles with that, email me and we will figure it out. Also know you can take the quizzes on Launchpad, and if it takes a while to integrate into Canvas, that's okay. They'll show up eventually. So if you take quizzes 1 through 5 and then don't integrate until quiz 6, all of those grades will still show up. So please email me if you have any questions, or you can show up to office hours. I'm really looking forward to continuing this class with you all, and I hope you have a good day or night or whatever it is.